Well, welcome everybody. My name's Bob Truby, and I serve as the director of the Emerging Scholars Network, and I'd love to welcome you to this Emerging Scholars Network conversation. Hopefully, we'll have a few more people still joining us today. But in the meanwhile, I want to just welcome you and give you a little bit of sense of what we're going to be doing today. Stories are powerful. They can lift us up, they depress us, anger us, and sometimes they stir us to action or even set the course of our lives. Our conversation today is about those stories, the stories of our own lives, the stories that we encounter in literature, and the story of Scripture, and the power of stories reflected upon to nourish our lives. Before we get into that conversation with our guest, Jennifer Holberg, I'll just share a few housekeeping details. We are recording today's conversation, and if you prefer not to be recorded or photographed, please leave your mic muted and disable your video by continuing to participate with your video and audio enabled. Once our recording begins, you'll consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity purposes. I'm going to stop the recording now for a moment to allow you to set your video and audio as you would prefer. Recording. Our speaker today is Jennifer Holberg, who has a PhD from the University of Washington. She's a professor and the chair of the English department at Calvin University, and she's the co-director of the Calvin Center for Faith and Writing, the home of the Festival of Faith and Writing, which many of you may have heard of. She's a founding co-editor of the academic journal Pedagogy, and also the editor of Shouts and Whispers. 21 writers speak about their writing and their faith. She's also the author of the book that we're going to be talking about today, Nourishing Narratives, which you can see actually in the background on her screen. So Jennifer, we'd love to welcome you to talk about the book and a lot of other things about books and reading and story. And if you'll, there you go, unmuted. Good deal. So welcome, Jennifer. Glad to have you with us.
Thanks for coming. I know it's right before the semester is starting, so I appreciate your time today. Excited to talk to folks. I think the emerging scholars, it's a really important kind of demographic for me. I feel like it's such a hard time to be entering into academia, and so really feel like anything we can do to help each other and encourage each other in our work as graduate students, as early professionals is really important. And so I'm really honored to be here and chat with you.
I really appreciate that. I've always felt like the grad students, sometimes people think about grad students as doing something really safe. And yet I say, boy, to spend years and years of your life doing research, to have invested in your education and all of this, and with an uncertain job market on the other end of things,
right.
That's risky business.
Well, and I think, as we're going to talk about the power of narrative, it's very interesting to think about the stories we used to tell in say the 80s and 90s, and the stories that we're telling now and how that shapes people's expectations as in professional ways. And that's and just the way the profession has changed so dramatically in the last 30 years or so. So yeah, no, I have a lot of respect for young academics trying to come through the system, and trying to think about how we who are senior academics, I guess that's what I am now with all my gray hair, how we need to be stepping up and providing mentorship and leadership and more opportunities for in a shrinking pool of opportunities. So yeah, thank you again for your time today. Yeah.
Great. Well, I thought just to begin and kind of in a fun way introduce you. I wanted to ask you a question that I asked some of my fellow bookworms at my Bob on Books Facebook page recently, and that was, what is your earliest reading memory?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so because you told me this was going to be our question, I actually went to one of my bookshelves. I'm at home today, and my very earliest one is this little scrapbook that my mother made so I was born in 68, and my mother sort of took cutouts from various things and made like a little picture book for us. And so as I look at these images, they're the sort of the very earliest images I remember. So really, this is it, this little scrapbook my mother made.
Wow.
And then my favorite little book this is again from the 60s, Miss Susie. It's about a little gray squirrel who lives in an attic and has this lovely little life. And then these terrible other squirrels break in and they ruin her life. And she opens a box of toy soldiers, and they sort of help restore order, and she goes back to living alone. And it's very funny because I currently and always have lived alone, and I come from a military background, so this book feels somewhat predictive. But yes, it's falling apart, it doesn't have a back cover anymore. But Miss Susie by Miriam Young, and it's illustrated by the same guy who did Frog and Toad. So if you know Frog and Toad. But I noticed as I was looking at it last night, as I got it out, that on the very first page, you probably can't see this, but it says my book, which I wrote in at some point just to remind people whose book this was. So that's the earliest memory. Yeah. So
that looks like a book version of the Velveteen Rabbit to me.
Yes, exactly.
All the fur rubbed off and everything.
Yes. And my father tells me that when he would read it, if he would skip a single word, I would, have to correct him and help him get every single word in Miss Susie, and we would read it every single day. So, yep.
Yep. Every single day. Okay. Well,
yeah, probably multiple times.
The next time I hear squirrels scampering on my roof, I will think of Miss Susie.
Think about Miss Susie, who just lived a very nice life in the attic. She wasn't trying to cause any trouble.
Well, let's, moving into Nourishing Narratives and into your book. In the first chapter, you actually invite us to become more comfortable and engaged with complicated narratives. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what that means or involves.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would say, the book is really even more beyond books, right? I mean, I really want this idea of all of the narratives that we have, whether that's our self-talk, right? Like, oh, I'm the pretty one, I'm the not favorite child, I'm whatever, to narratives that are coming at us through film, through TV, through media, so I want us to really sort of make narrative a bigger term than books, although I think books are really important. But I also think, and those of you who are in, I'm excited that there's some language and literature people here. We love to say that, oh, we want complicated narratives, except when we have them, we are sometimes uncomfortable with them, particularly in the church. So one of my examples is my church had decided that we were going to do the whole Bible. We were in Sunday school. We were not going to just do the little happy stories. We were going to embrace complicated narratives for the children. And I'm one of the storytellers that comes in. I don't do it every week, but the first one I was assigned to was Job, for people who are from kindergarten to 5th grade. And I thought, well, take that, Dr. Complicated Narrative. How am I going to talk about the book of Job with these little kids in an appropriate way, but also in a way that embraces the fact that's a really hard and it's complicated story. And then just a couple weeks later, they assigned me again to the Israelites who had to die off before they could go in, before the rest of them could go into the promised land. Again, not that awesome for first graders. So how do we think about that? So in that first chapter, I kind of have a little rubric of ways that I started trying to interrogate myself as to why I was uncomfortable with this. Is it because my theology needs some adjustment? Is it what is it? And so one of the points of this book is to really, in a kind of accessible way, the book is written for a general audience, but how do we begin to bring a kind of hermeneutic that embraces complication and acknowledges that these narratives are hard. I think a lot of people who deconstruct or who when we struggle, it's partly because we're wanting to be reductive, right? We want to get to an answer, we want to get to a checklist, we want to get to rules, and I just don't think the Bible is like that. And if you live in this kind of messy space of story, it starts to help you think about the kind of messy hermeneutic you want to have, which is, yeah, it's complicated. It's hard. We have to think about the ways in which we have competing narratives, and sometimes they aren't overlapping with a biblical one. So, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I know one of the complicated biblical narratives I've always wrestled with is the sacrifice of Isaac, and
Right.
And tell that story to children.
Right, which we do.
We do.
Right? But we tell it in these triumphalistic ways, right? And we don't always tell it in the ways that have both lament and love. We try to make it all pretty and happy at the end. And you just think about what was that like as their relationship continued, right? And I think that's why I think story is really interesting. So, I'm old enough, and I was in Campus Crusade in college, so I was one of those people. But mostly because that's what my campus had. But there's a famous book in the 80s in Campus Crusade called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And that's a very particular way of approaching faith, right? We're going to have this book that has all these propositions. But my argument in the book is that people are actually more shaped by story than they are by law or by facts. Now, I think there can be some real downsides to that. And we can probably think of some examples. But if you think about the way people really make decisions, or how they process the world, it's really through story. So therefore, as Christians, we need to be very self-aware of the kinds of stories that we're imbibing, and the ones that are kind of taking us to growth, and the ones that are taking us away from growth. And there's probably, I wouldn't say there's just black and white, only nourishing or detoxic, but I do think that it's really interesting the ways in which sometimes we're culturally, we have cultural beliefs that we baptize as Christian, but they really aren't, when you actually look at the scripture, or when you look at the complications of what the scripture presents. I mean, I think Isaac is a great example, and I think Noah's Ark. I often say to my students, like, why would you put that on your children's, you want cute animals or whatever, but that story itself is, right, it's only a good story if you're on the ark. But if you're not on the ark, if you change the subject position of the story, like that's a terrifying and really terrible story. So, and and if anyone says, oh, the Bible's view is this, well, what about this and what about this, right? It's a complicated text, and it asks us for a lifetime of study. And if that's true, then that should also make us more humble and more generous in the way that we come to the interpretive act. So, yeah.
Well, it strikes me that life is complicated sometimes.
Correct.
Maybe most of the time, that life isn't simple and straightforward.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of, if we think about our own unhappinesses, or we are both old enough to probably know people who've had midlife crises. I actually think a midlife crisis is basically a failure of imagination, or a kind of lack of a robust enough story. So people will get to 40 or whatever age it is, and they'll say, is this all there is? Which implies that they had a sort of sense, they had a story that they've been telling themselves that now has kind of run out. And they don't have a rich enough story about how complex life is, or how you deal with various things. Or when people say, I can't even imagine, this happening, and that's actually true, they can't. And so often I think why we need to be in church, why we need to be in fellowship with each other, is to continue to hear more and more and more stories. And I think the church is one of the last intergenerational spaces in our culture, in American culture anyway, that allows me to hear stories of people who've been through a lot more than I have. But also, I make this point at the end of the book, and this may resonate with those of you who work with students. One of the stories that really annoys me the most is kind of kids these days. And I've been an academic long enough that I've heard various versions of kids these days. But it's like always how terrible the latest generation is. And I was talking to my colleague David Smith the other day, who some of you may know. He writes wonderful books about Christian education. But anyway, he was saying he'd seen a study that they did a survey, and everyone thought their own generation was awesome and always made great decisions, but they thought every other generation was very messed up. And it like cut across. And I just think, one of the things, there's that wonderful verse in Psalms about one generation will testify to another. And when I was younger, I always thought that meant old people will talk to younger people, right? They'll have lived this long life and they're testifying of God's, great acts. But I actually think if you look at that verse, it's about generations speaking to each other. And so those of us who work in collegiate situations, what a wonderful gift we have to be learning from younger people. And those of you who are graduate students and who are younger yourself, right? The profession really needs to be hearing from you too, and not just letting the senior people talk. And so often in academics, it's the star system, right? You go to the conference and it's, people are looking at your name tag and like, not famous, so don't care. And then, oh, see the person, right? And so we have a lot of stories in academia, I think, about what makes us successful, what doesn't make us successful, all of that can be very soul crushing by the time you get to be a mid-career academic, and you don't think maybe you've had a very successful career, right? And I think one of the great things about a Christian organization like yours is to help us continue to think about what values we actually have that help us resist the stories that our guild tells us that can be very much like, well, you're not that important because you've poured into teaching, and that's not the most important thing, or you've only had 15 articles and you should have had 16, or what, academia is always about how you're not enough. Every single stage is, well, what else are you going to do though? And, oh, you published a book, what's your next one? And I think that that's something that we have to continue to be in fellowship and understand the narratives of the scripture, to help us counter some of the toxic narratives that really inhabit our workspace. So that's a long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. And the last chapter of your book, especially, I just appreciated your conversations about this generation and just the evident love that you have for your students and what you hope for them. For people who work in the university, I thought that alone was worth the price of admission.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think for one thing, I feel very privileged. I'm a full-time academic. That's not true for 70% of people in higher education, right? So I still get to be a full-time person. I have an office, and I have a admin, and a lot of things that a lot of people don't have, that are working really hard to teach students. But I just think, man, my life is, I get to read books and talk about them. And I also get to, I talk a lot about general education. And I really feel like there needs to be, one of the reasons I think the humanities have suffered in America is because they haven't been invested in at the college level. So in other words, we ask the least experienced people to teach the gen ed classes, which actually I think you need to have the most experience to teach. So graduate students are wonderful because they're so they're so engaged with the scholarship of the moment, and they know they're in touch with just the latest and the greatest of whatever their field is, which is not actually true of senior professors sometimes, right? We've been around so long. We're the ones who should be teaching the gen ed classes, and we also have the most experience with teaching. And but it's exactly the opposite, right? We ask the least experienced teachers to teach the broadest subjects, and we leave the most specialized subjects for the senior people. And it in my mind, it doesn't make that much sense. But it also, like, I love teaching the engineer and the business person and the person who's going to be a nurse, because I want them to understand that the humanities, that especially literature, but also history and art and all of those things, they make a difference in the way that they're a person in the world. And so this is why I've written a book about why I think story is so important for everyone, is because I just think that if we could do more of that in church, and in our religious spaces, we can really sort of redeem the time, if you will. So yeah, I love teaching gen ed. This semester, that's all I'm the chair now, and so I assigned the courses. So I gave myself an English 101. I'm teaching a freshman composition class and a Brit Lit survey. And I'm excited. I love that stuff because it's so exciting to see a student tell me he's never read a book or he hates reading, and by the end he's quoting Tennyson to me. So
that's a win.
That's a win, man. Anytime you can get people to quote Tennyson, hey.
Hey, well, speaking of books, I wonder if you might tell us just a little bit about the rest of the book and how it unpacks this idea of story, whether it's our story or our culture stories, stories we read, the big story, how that shapes our lives and nourishes our faith and the work of becoming better readers. So tell us a little bit about the rest of the book and how you kind of unpack some of these things.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, the first chapter is kind of what we've been talking about, like any good dissertation or whatever. It lays out kind of the overview and the main claims of what I'm trying to talk about. But then the book kind of divides in half. The first sort of chapters 2, 3, and 4 are not really case studies. So those of you who actually do real case studies, don't call me out on that. But kind of loosely, I take a couple of characteristics of God. So God as the God of plenitude, the God of faithfulness, the God who's our friend. And I look at what if we told a different story about God? How would that shape the stories that we tell about ourselves? And so I try to link the idea that the way we conceptualize God really helps us conceptualize ourselves. And I give kind of 3 examples of that. It's also a book that is kind of an implicit book. So I tell a lot of stories to get to the point. It's a lot less sort of do this, do that, or academic-y, like making an argument, and more kind of an indirect book. So just fair warning on that. The 5th chapter is a bit of a hinge. It's on vocation. At Calvin, where I teach, that's a huge topic of conversation always, about how students, what their calling is and how they're going to live into that. But I think so often, as I was already kind of referencing earlier, we get very hung up on success narratives. And so I really ask us to think about a different kind of vocational success and what that might look like. And then the last bit of the book is the last 4 chapters is about if we sort of started telling different and better stories, how would that affect the kind of things we do in community, in terms of dealing with hard things, death, illness, social issues, and how would that lead us to kind of being able to I would say with integrity, tell stories of hope. So not kind of triumphalistic stories, but stories that actually do offer hope, even as they are complicated, is going back to that. And then the final chapter, my editor, actually, I was going to end with that chapter. And my editor said, I really think you should talk about being a learner and a teacher, and how we then learn how to do that, and what our attitudes are towards learners. So the last chapter is really about kind of then operationalizing all of it, I guess. So that's kind of it. Two halves: stories about God, why that makes a difference, and then maybe a little tiny 9th chapter addendum.
Well, I'm glad your editor encouraged that addendum. I thought that was a real valuable addition to the book, in addition to just the rich material all the way through, that just kind of created for me a sense of again capturing something of the wonder of this life that we live in Christ, and the journey that we're engaged in.
Well, and I just think it's really important. I think classrooms, they're private spaces in a sense. It's just you and your students. And so much of it never sort of makes it, I don't think people always totally understand the work of the professor or of the student either. But there's so much good stuff we do. And there's one section of that chapter where I talk about, I decided to take my own exam, which I thought was a useful thing to do. I tend to read along with my students just to kind of make sure that my assignments are not completely. Sometimes I think, Jennifer, what were you thinking? Like, it's too much reading for today. But also just to keep it fresh. But I also think occasionally you have to continue to be that learner, and you have to continue to think about what you yourself are learning from these texts. Because I think it can get really stale after a while. And one of the things I think happens with some older professors is they start to get irritated that their students don't get it instantly. But how could they? Right. And so you have to continue to think about, this is a thing that's new for them today. They just read that poem. They just read that text. They've never thought this thought. And even if it's a really obvious thought and it's a really basic thing, I just think you have to continue to remember that for this 18-year-old sitting in your class, this is the first time this idea has ever struck them. And so that kind of patience and forbearance and also joy, like, hey, not to get irritated with them that they're not already getting it, but that, you get to see them in this process of discovery. But also, what are you learning? And what is now new, or what are they bringing to you that you maybe hadn't occurred to you that there's a connection with the Marvel universe? Okay. It's like, oh, well, I never thought of that, but that's true.
Yeah. Well, hey, we're going to take a break and just let people know about your book and how to get it, particularly at a little bit of a discount. So let me put up a screen here. So the book we're talking about is Nourishing Narratives by Jennifer Holberg. It's available at InterVarsity Press, and we'll put this link into the chat. And you can use, at checkout, you can use the code ESNWeb until August 24th and get a 30% discount on the book with free shipping.
Which is cheaper than Amazon.
Yeah, it is cheaper, and free shipping as well. So what a deal, So let me get that into the chat here. And there we go. That so you have that information in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and transfer us to gallery view and invite, and since we have a small group here today, if you want to, if we people would like to just engage directly rather than through chat questions, they can do that. If you're more comfortable putting your question in the chat, please feel free to do that as well.
Yeah, happy to talk.
Yeah. Just remember to unmute yourself before you ask your question. Well, while we're okay, go ahead, Sheila.
Thank you. Well, do you believe there is still a place for Christian scholars in secular liberal arts schools? Are the secular and Christian narratives so much at odds that Christian scholars kind of have to retreat to Christian colleges?
Yeah, that's a great question. I my own training is completely in secular spaces. I went to all university, state universities and university ofs. So when I came to Calvin, I had never ever been to a Christian college. And it's funny, my whole career now has been at one, but I actually think it's really important that we stay in all spaces. And yes, I think we do have competing narratives, but I think that it's something where that's part of, I think, a call into what kind of space you're going to be in and who you're going to be speaking to in the guild, right? I think at Christian colleges, we still expect to be fully participating in our professional organizations at a level that is as excellent as anyone else. And I think that's a certain kind of testimony that we don't just go off and do kind of like our little Christian scholarship that only Christians would appreciate, that we do. I edit a journal that's published by Duke University Press. And one of the reasons we went with Duke is because, and at the time I founded it as a graduate student. But yeah, we wanted to participate in the larger conversation, but I do think that we still need to be there. And I also think it's one the thing that comes to my mind is about maybe 10 years ago, I went on I was selected to be on an NEH fellowship. They've discovered that no one's teaching Dante anymore, which is very sad. But instead of asking Dante scholars, they ask people at community colleges, historically Black colleges and universities, liberal arts colleges. Anyway, you had to be someone like me who teaches a lot of gen ed. And then they basically brought us to Italy for the whole summer and gave us basically a graduate level seminar with all the very famous Dante people. But what was fascinating is there were a few people in there, in this cohort. There were only about 15 of us. There were a couple of us from Christian universities, and then everybody else was from all sorts of places. But as we spent the summer, and obviously we're talking about Dante, so there were easy ways to talk about that. But there's lots of ways people look at Dante without even a faith lens, which is kind of fascinating to me. But as we would talk, at almost every lunch or, social event, we would have someone would ask me about my faith, which I did not expect. I expected to go to this thing and just be very sort of geek out on Dante together in a scholarly way. But as people knew that I was a Christian, they would sort of ask me about things, and they would say, I've never actually met a Christian before, or this will sound braggy, but like, you seem pretty cool for one. I didn't know Christians could be cool. Or you seem sort of funny. And I think just the sort of lived embodiment of being a person in the seminar with them was a testimony in and of itself, without me ever sort of saying, have you heard of the 4 spiritual laws? God loves you. That never happened. We were just all, scholars together. And by the end of the trip, I went with a number of the other women on the trip. We went to Cinque Terre, and we were out swimming. And one of the women said to me, I just feel so grateful in this moment, and I don't know who to thank, but I feel like there's somebody. And she goes, and she turned to me and she goes, and I think you would say you do know who to thank. And I said, yeah, I do. And I think that's a great starting place for you to think about, where are you going to go next? And what do you think about these things? So I think there's ways to be really winsome in the academy without being preachy, without being any of those things, but just doing our work as unto the Lord, treating our colleagues. The other thing is it's the academy can be so awful, and where people are so mean to each other. And I think to be a different kind of person, and confident about, like, hey, you know what? I know who I am. And I think what I have seen in my life is that kind of winsomeness really does come across to people in ways that you don't really have to do much else. So yes, I think we should be everywhere. Because I think there's no, obviously I'm a Calvinist, that, I'm into the every square inch. And I do think that every square inch of the academy is God's, and needs witnesses there and people doing good work to explore God's work and God's creation. So that was a really long answer. I'm sorry.
Very helpful.
It's a great question, Sheila. Thank you. Hey, we were talking about Dante here, and one of the things I did want to ask you about that seems like a good chance is you do talk a lot about Dante in your book.
I do.
And why for you is that such an important story? And do you have any recommendations of a version of Dante that people might read if they're intrigued?
Yeah, so I'll take the second part first. I typically use Mark Musa's, it's the portable Dante, mostly just because it's nice to have it all together. But I always encourage people to sort of go on an online resource and look at so many different translations and see the one that like sort of speaks to you. Because there's lots of different ones. Some people really love like Dorothy L. Sayers, like the way she does it. Some people like one that's the Musa one is a little bit more accessible. That's what I use with students. I will say for the notes, I really love the Hollanders. I think they do an amazing job. So if you're a scholar, or even if you're just someone who likes to understand a lot more, I think they have the best sort of scholarly apparatus, at least for me. I think and this is obviously if you don't want to do a dual side. My brother has been teaching himself Italian, so he can read it in Italian. I am not at that level of scholarship. My language was French, so I do okay. But anyway, and then there's lots of wonderful online resources. Baylor, with a bunch of other universities, including Calvin, did 100 Days of Dante project. And so you can look, and there's a little like 10-minute video on every single canto. So, and like any big project like that, they're varying quality, or you may connect with ones differently, but that's great. And there's a thing called World of Dante that has wonderful things. So for example, when he's in heaven, when he's in the Paradiso, he I'm sorry, in the Purgatorio, he keeps hearing Gregorian chant, and they have all of it recorded, so you can literally hear what he's hearing. But for me, Dante has been really, it was always something I enjoyed teaching. But I will say that this seminar obviously was sort of revolutionary, particularly in its sense of connecting Dante really firmly with his Franciscan commitments. And I think once you understand it from that point of view, you can read it in the sort of generic Christian journey and epic conventions and all of that. But this idea that, first of all, God comes to get us in our darkest moment when we don't know how to get out, I find that really powerful. That he always travels with a companion. I think that's really important, because I think at least American Christianity can be a very Lone Rangery, and me and Jesus will just do it. And I love this kind of witnesses that he comes across. I love the kind of ways that we have to recognize sin. We have to think about sanctification. And then in Paradiso, he actually asks a million questions. It's sort of the most intellectual. You would think the closer you get to God, the fewer questions you would have. But in fact, it's amazing to give you permission to like ask all the questions. God's open to that. That's what his journey through the Paradiso is. So I just think on so many levels, there's lots of takeaways. And it's such a rich text that you can just, every time you read it, you see new stuff. And, you know, as someone who's not a Danteist or an Italian scholar, I just always feel like I'm learning and seeing new insights. And yeah, I just think it's powerful, and taught correctly, students love it. And really thinking about what is the role of reform, but throughout church history. So the Franciscan reform, like he puts popes in hell for a reason, because they have not, it's about money, and it's about trying to figure out a way to live the Christian life in the way that's correct. And obviously, as a Florentine, money, that's, that is true for them, and it's true for us. So I see we've got some other things.
Well, Chase, I see your hand up, but I think Yun Jung had a question first that I'm going to come to. She says, at times when our faces are stuck in cell phones and laptop, people seem to get messages better through images. How should our narrative be adapted to be appealing and relevant in much more of an image-oriented age?
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And that's why I said earlier that I think that, I want people to think about the TV they watch, the movies they watch, why they love TikTok, right? Why are TikTok dances like such a thing? And so I think the image-driven thing is exactly right. But I still think that the kind of hermeneutic we can bring to it is sort of can be adapted. I think, though, the other thing that you say that's important really reminds me of T.S. Eliot in the Four Quartets. He says, we're distracted from distraction by distraction. He wrote that in the 40s, but that just seems like that seems like our scrollable world, right? Everything is a distraction. I don't know if those of you who teach have had this, but I'm finding we're having to think a lot more deliberately with students about how to read. Not just what they're getting out of the reading, but physically being able to sit and look at an older text or a scientific text or anything that you need some time without looking at your phone all the time, right? Just looking over. But I think in terms of images and in terms of visual narratives, yeah, I think those are really powerful. And one of the things I do with my own students is we look at memes, and we think about the genre of memes, so that there are some things you can't use the burning house little kid for certain, right? And there's all kinds of generic conventions that they can take from their knowledge of literature and adapt into the kind of literature of memes, if you will. But also, like, why are those images powerful? And what story is embedded then in that narrative? So if it's a narrative that's is it a nostalgia? Is it something that's calling on nostalgia? Is it calling on sort of a version of sexuality? Well, is that the version we would approve of? Is that right? So I think they can still all be filtered through something. We just have to then do one more level, because it's like, well, what is this what is this narrative? What is this visual narrative telling us? So in my 101 class this semester, we take Calvin, what propaganda is probably the wrong word, but Calvin advertising. And we look at the pictures and say, what story is our university trying to tell? And how do you know that?
Good.
Well, it's trying to say that we're global. Well, that is true. It is factually true that we're global, but the whole picture is, right, there's only one white kid. Well, that's not exactly true. We have a diverse population, but maybe not as diverse as the picture shows. So that's something where we're saying, there's a story being told here, and then how would we assess that picture? So yeah, I think it's more complicated. Obviously, we could probably talk about this for a long time, the way we engage with the visual, but that would be my kind of baby steps.
Chase, thanks for waiting. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, no problem. Actually, it looks like I'm looking at a different camera here. Jennifer just responded to my question, what I had, which my subfield discipline is media ecology, so studying technologies, and, influence and shape our attention spans and how we perceive stories and narratives. So you covered a lot of that. So that's the previous question there. Good question. I guess my kind of a related question is, how do you, and this is probably maybe super cliche question at this cultural moment, but how do you see in teaching storytelling and also consuming stories that are increasingly crafted by AI technology? I know that's kind of a hot topic, but it is.
Yeah. No, isn't that interesting, right? And so and you probably can answer this better than I can, but I was just on Instagram, and it was fascinating to me because there was some fake, it was clearly fake, but it was like Brad Pitt dancing. I'm not sure why the algorithm thought I needed to see that, but it was also that it was fake. You could tell it was drawn. So the question, I think there's a couple of different questions is, well, okay, first of all, we still can look at the narrative, right? Why is this something we want to see? But then, the kinds of, one of the things I've been struggling with my syllabus for this semester is, what's my policy going to be about the use of like something like ChatGPT or Bard, or, and it's because we've been having this debate in our own at Calvin, and I know it's everywhere, but how much should I allow them to use in a writing class? So is it okay to generate? Is it okay as kind of a help there? Is that or is that a skill I should be helping them develop? Is it a tool, right? And so that whole question of like, is it a tool? Is it plagiarism? What are all, and obviously at Calvin we talk a lot about integrity and faithfulness, and that we don't do this because that's who we are as people, that God calls us to something better. But then, is it a tool? I don't know. So I think you're right. I don't think it's a cliched question at all. It's sort of how do we think about the fact that now we're going to be getting things that are generated in ways that maybe are problematic, or are erasing the human person, or where's creativity in that? Or is it, there's just so many, it's such a fascinating world, and also so problematic because I can't quite decide what to do on my syllabus. I decide one way and then I think, well, but maybe we should be, and then the pragmatic part of me says, well, but maybe they're still going to, so should it be more about this is more like citing a source, that as long as they're registering the use of it. So no, I don't think I gave you a very good answer, but I definitely think there's so many different areas that we're going to have to, in the academy, help start thinking about what the questions even are, because I'm not sure we even know what all the questions are yet, as we ask people to assess it in an ethical or moral way.
Yeah, I agree. I have another question, but I will hold off for others and after what to do with the content of narrative. But thank you. Yeah, great. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think we could probably, this is somewhere where we're all going to have to learn from each other.
Yeah, I think so too.
Well, Jennifer, actually, it's kind of the time in our conversation where I invite you to have the last word. to bring it home. Believe it or not, boy.
Okay,
we
it's
could
that
be
last bit of class where you're supposed to be summarizing what we learned today, right?
something
Well,
like
first of
that.
all, just thank you so much, and really blessings on your work. If I would say, if you're looking for mentors, this is really not where I was going to go with the book, but if you're looking for mentors, there are a lot of people in the Christian college world anyway that are interested, and we aren't always that connected with graduate students because we mostly teach undergrads. But I would say do look around for us, and senior faculty sometimes are way more interested than we may appear. So you know, please know that there's a wider world in which you will can participate, or that we're willing to help. But I would say for the book, you know, I just really encourage all of us to be thinking about not necessarily what we read. I mean, there's lots of books in this space that are like, read Shakespeare and become a better person. I'm not necessarily convinced of that. I mean, I like Shakespeare, but I think it's more being attentive to the kinds of stories that are kind of constraining us, or that could help us get to, I think, the fullness of what God wants for us. So as we think about, I think graduate school is hard because you begin to think, ugh, I don't know anything. It's, you know, it can just be very demoralizing. And think about the stories that you're telling yourself about who you are in the book. And I'll end with this. You know, one of my favorite poets is Gerard Manley Hopkins, 19th century poet, and he has this wonderful poem. It's very the first half is he gets very wound up that the world is a burning trash heap, and nothing people do ever matters, and he just and about halfway through the poem he says, enough. Like, okay, let's let's give my brain a break. And then he says, enough, the resurrection. And the poem ends by talking about, because of what Christ has done, we get to be what Christ is. But he ends by saying, but even now, even as we're all this trashy stuff, right? And he goes through a list of all these things, we're already immortal diamond. So he says, you know, I'm patch, you know, match wood. I'm like, I'm not even whole cloth. I'm just a patch, but I'm already an immortal diamond. And even if the world's on fire, the fire burns away all of the bad stuff, and I will ultimately be only immortal diamond. But what I want to leave you with is, remember, you are immortal diamond, beloved gems, like beloved of God. And you know what, even if you don't finish your PhD, or if it's not the greatest, or if you know, whatever you do, you are already an immortal diamond, and you are already worthy of God's love today. And if we can just live into that story and help our students and the people with whom we live understand their immortal diamondness, I think that's the most nourishing narrative I can think of. So thank you again for your time today.
Jennifer, thank you so much. This has just been very, very rich, and I know we could go on further. We will leave the Zoom connection on for a few minutes after we end the recording if anybody wants to ask a question that didn't get a chance to. And we'll just, first of all, want to just mention again, the book that we've been talking about is Nourishing Narratives, and you can get that from InterVarsity Press. And there's a link that's in your chat, and you can use the discount code ESN Web until August 24th to get a 30% discount on the book, along with free shipping, which is better than Amazon does. I want to tell you about our next conversation. Our next conversation is with Paul Louis Metzger. He has a new book that's just coming out called More Than Things, that addresses the culture of commodification that we live in. Too often people are just defined by what they do or own, and treated as means to an end or cogs in a machine. And in a world dominated by things, Paul Louis Metzger argues we must account for one another's personhood. In a sense, we're going to continue the conversation about story and the kinds of stories we're telling as a culture. So Paul Louis Metzger teaches Christian theology and the theology of culture at Multnomah University and Seminary. And the conversation will be on September 24th, 2023. It'll be at 3 p.m. Eastern time because Paul's coming in from the West Coast. And the registration link is on the screen and also in your chat, and you can register for that conversation today if you wish. Finally, I want to just say thanks to everybody for joining us today. Thank you for taking time out of what I know is a full schedule at the beginning of a semester to be with us, and for great questions. I especially want to thank Jennifer for taking time out of your schedule and being a part of our conversation. And I do want to acknowledge InterVarsity Press, the publisher of the book, and also who assists us with great discounts and publicity for this event. So thanks to InterVarsity Press. This conversation today is being brought to you by the Emerging Scholars Network. And you can go to our website, which is blog.emergingscholars.org, and click the join button if you're not already a member, and we'd love for you to join us. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Jennifer mentioned Finding Mentors, and we often publish articles by a variety of Christians in the Academy, some through the Christian Scholars Review, some of our own our blog articles and other articles that we source that will appear on our particularly on our Facebook and Twitter accounts, and or X, as we should probably call it now. Please, I need to update this slide. But at any rate, please do follow us and use that as a great resource in your scholarship. Lastly, I want to mention that this conversation has been recorded and will be on our YouTube channel, so you can tell your friends. And we have about 45 other conversations available on our YouTube channel that can be both great resources for you to listen to or watch, as well as to share together, perhaps in a graduate, student, or faculty community. And so please consider using that as a resource and subscribe to find out about updates. Well, that's
Bob,
it.
Can I mention that also the Festival of Faith and Writing? You mentioned
please.
at the beginning, we have our dates April 11 through 13, 2024 on the campus of Calvin University. It's going to be wonderful. September, we announce our keynotes, and we have, and also the 75 other writers that are coming. So it is a readers conference. You don't have to be a writer to come, but it's a wonderful gathering. We've been doing it over 30 years, and all disciplines are welcome, and if you need housing, things like that, we have full information about that. So please do think about coming to the festival and following the Center for Faith and Writing.
Well, I've heard great things about it. I've sometimes been tempted to try to come.
You got to come this year. You know me now. All of you can say you know me.
There it is. There it is. Well, Jennifer, thank you again. We will stop the recording and welcome people to stick around if they can.